Hello and welcome to Generation 16, the series that showcases the games of Sega's Mega Drive. I'm your host, Greg Seward. In this episode, we move into the final month of 1990, but not before cleaning up a few games released for the Sega MegaNet service in Japan. After that, we kick off December with another classic action game featuring Joe Musashi. Let's get started. One of Phantasy Star 2's major downsides was the complete lack of backstory for most of its heroes. There were 8 playable characters setting out to destroy Mother Brain and save the star system, and almost none of them were really explained. Sega used the MegaNet service and the Mega Modem to alleviate this problem. Over the course of 1990 and 1991, it released a series of 8 text adventures through the Sega Game Toshokan cartridge that explained the origins and motivations for each character. The first of these features the bounty hunter Amia, and was released on the same day as the modem itself. I haven't covered it yet because when I started doing this show, the release dates on these games were a bit fuzzy, so now here we are. When I covered Putter Golf, I mentioned how games on the Toshokan service needed to be rather small, both due to the amount of storage memory on the cartridge, as well as the relatively slow download speed of the service. Remember, this is 1990. In the Phantasy Star text adventures, this results in a very sparse presentation. You get a few nice character portraits and 1 or 2 original music tracks, but otherwise you're really just getting a whole lot of text. Some of the earliest computer games were text adventures. These games started to appear more frequently in the mid-1970s with the likes of Adventure and Zork. Remember, computers weren't powerhouses back then. On-screen graphics weren't really a possibility in most cases. These games featured text input that handled everything from inventory management to movement, and required you to use your imagination to picture the things being described on screen rather than seeing them for yourself. They were the precursor to classic graphic adventures from developers like Sierra Online and Lucasfilm Games. Most of these games are notorious today for their insanely difficult puzzles. But as Leisure Suit Larry creator Al Lowe pointed out in a 2012 interview, computer gamers back then were by their very nature patient. You had to be a puzzle solver just to get your computer to work a lot of the time, messing around with AutoExec BAT and config sys files just to make your games run at all. Thankfully, the Phantasy Star text adventures are a bit more modern than all that. They play closer to a classic digital novel, entirely menu-driven with a simple movement interface. The puzzles can be a bit tricky, but for the most part, as long as you search every nook and cranny and build up your inventory, most puzzles can be solved by simply attempting to use everything you have in your possession on a particular object. That's not to say death is impossible. One of the hallmarks of early text adventures is how unforgiving they are for a single wrong decision. And the Phantasy Star text adventures carry on the tradition. Walking the wrong direction or choosing to investigate the wrong thing at the wrong time can lead to a quick game over. One other major issue you face with the Phantasy Star games is that the battle system is based entirely on luck, and there is a major shortage of healing items. When fighting, you're a slave to the roll of the dice, and if you happen to get on an unlucky streak, even the weakest of enemies can take you down, and there is no way to save your progress in the Phantasy Star text adventures. Amia's story takes place only a couple of years before the start of Phantasy Star 2, and outlines her experience chasing a rogue Motavian bounty hunter named Hack. After a harrowing journey through mountains and deserts, she catches up to her prey, only to learn he's not exactly who she thought he was. On that day, she vows to become a counter hunter, only to chase hunters who have gone truly bad, rather than simply anyone with a price on their head. The third game released on the SegaNet service was, of all things, an RPG. Fatal Labyrinth is a game where players must work their way through 30 mostly randomly generated floors of danger, gathering loot, upgrading their equipment, and leveling up to take on more powerful challenges on higher floors. Your ultimate goal is to reach the top floor and reclaim the Holy Goblet without dying. Movement is tile-based, so each time you tap the D-pad, the hero moves one space in that direction. If there is an enemy in that direction, or you tap the action button, the hero will attack. When the player makes either of those moves, every monster on the level is free to do one of the same two actions, move or attack. Attack success is based on your hero's current ability, the power of the weapon he's using, and good old luck. The type of weapon is important too. Swords are generally very powerful, but have a low hit rate, while axes are middle-of-the-road weapons, and spears are weak, but have a high hit rate. As you journey through hallways, new rooms become visible, complete with new monsters and new loot. A big part of the game revolves around picking up new weapons, armor, potions, and scrolls. You're only able to carry a limited amount of each, so inventory management becomes a big component of the game really quickly. One really cool bit about the game is how the hero's sprite actually changes based on the equipment he's wearing. That's not something you saw a lot of in console games back in 1990. You'll also see food scattered throughout the levels. Food regulates your health. Your hero heals based on his relative hunger level, so keeping yourself fed is important. However, if you eat too much, you get fat and start to slow down. Eat even more and you can actually die. Yes, Fatal Labyrinth allows players to eat themselves to death. You'll also notice bags of money lying around. It's a bit confusing at first since you don't ever get a chance to actually spend it. But after you die a few times, you'll notice that the number of villagers who attend your funeral is directly proportional to how much money you had when you died. That's one of the many things about this game that just makes me smile. Fatal Labyrinth is what you'd call a roguelike, which literally means it's like a game called Rogue, which was created in 1980 by Michael Toy, Glenn Wickman, and Glenn Arnold. It was an ASCII graphics dungeon crawler featuring procedurally generated levels. The goal was to get to the bottom of the dungeon, retrieve an amulet, and get back to the top again. The creators originally distributed the game on the Unix system at UC Santa Cruz. It later moved to UC Berkeley. They have said previously that Rogue was inspired by the text adventure game Adventure, which we just looked at in the previous Phantasy Star text adventure segment. Dungeons & Dragons was also a major influence on Rogue. Every enemy was originally based on a D&D monster. Rogue inspired a whole genre of permadeath loot-collecting dungeon crawlers, some of the most famous being NetHack and Diablo. Fatal Labyrinth represents one of the earliest roguelikes to make it to a game console. And yeah, you heard right, permadeath. Fatal Labyrinth features no save option, so if you die, you're done. Well, kind of. You can continue from the last checkpoint, which happens every 5 levels. But if you turn the system off, you lose all your progress. Even when the game was eventually released in the US and the UK on its own cartridge, it did not have a battery backup option. People buying Fatal Labyrinth when it was released as a standalone game in 1991 had to be a bit confused at just how basic it all seemed. The music is extremely repetitive, as are the visuals. The game doesn't have a save feature, it just feels archaic next to previous titles like Phantasy Star 2. But then again, all of this happened for a reason. This was a downloadable game in 1990, and thus the file size had to stay pretty small. At least Sega of America released it as a budget title on these shores. Not the last time it would do that with a game from the Sega Toshokan service. Much like Putter Golf before it, there are Master System and Game Gear games that are too similar to Fatal Labyrinth to be a coincidence. In December of 1990, Sega released Dragon Crystal, a roguelike for the portable Game Gear. It plays almost exactly the same as Fatal Labyrinth, and even shares some of the graphical elements found in Fatal Labyrinth. Later in 1991, Dragon Crystal made its way to the Master System. While it doesn't appear that the two development teams had a lot of crossover, it is worth noting that 2 of the Fatal Labyrinth development group are Hirozaku Yasuhara and Naoto Oshima. The first will be the main gameplay and level designer of the upcoming Sonic the Hedgehog, while the second is the man who actually designed the characters of Sonic and Eggman. Fatal Labyrinth hasn't really stood the test of time, but it is kind of interesting to check it out nowadays and see sort of the beginnings of the roguelike on consoles. The second Phantasy Star 2 text adventure stars Shilka, the thief. Shilka was an odd character in the original game in that she was practically useless in battle without gaining an absurd amount of experience first. But she was actually one of the most useful characters in the game thanks to her ability to steal valuable items from the various stores in each town. Indeed, the Visiphone, an item that allows you to save wherever you want in Phantasy Star 2, is only available via Shilka's light fingers. Shilka's adventure reveals her privileged past. Growing up the daughter of rich parents, Shilka wanted for nothing, and was subsequently bored of her cushy lifestyle. This boredom produced one of the finest thieves ever to set foot on Motavia. This game covers Shilka's quest to steal a priceless painting, the Opa Opa. It's much less linear and less combat heavy than the previous game focused on Amia. The entire adventure takes place mostly in a single building, featuring elevators that only go to select floors, robot sentries, and lots of stealth. It's much more of a puzzle game than Amia's bounty hunter story. It also requires a lot more attention paid to your surroundings. In fact, I had to create a small map in order to keep track of which elevators took me to which floors, and what I would find on each one. In December of 1988, NEC released a CD-ROM add-on for its PC Engine in Japan. With this extra storage, players enjoyed bigger games with real music and voice acting. In late 1990, NEC brought the accessory to the US to bolster the flagging fortunes of its TurboGrafx 16. Unfortunately, the $400 price tag and sort of lackluster hardware specs did it no favors. Around the middle of 1990, US magazines started reporting on rumblings that Sega was working on a CD-ROM device of its own for the Mega Drive. In its October 1990 issue, EGM ran one of the earliest concept images of the drive, complete with a report that the system would cost around $200 and would mostly match the specs of the TurboGrafx CD. The unit was to be available in Japan in the spring of 1991. The December 1990 issue of EGM featured some of the first concrete information about the new hardware. This was a replacement for the rumored floppy disk drive Sega had been working on. It was to feature more memory than the Turbo CD, alleviating the problems that system had with constant disk access interrupting gameplay. It would launch in the spring of 1991, feature a $200 price tag, and games would retail for between $25 and $30. The CD drive, which would sit beneath the Mega Drive, would also include an 8-channel PCM sound generator, enabling the Frankenstein system to pump out much more impressive audio than the Mega Drive by itself. EGM reported that the system would be shown at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show happening in Las Vegas in January 1991, and I began saving my pennies. Almost a year after he first appeared on the Mega Drive, Joe Musashi is back on the console once again in Shadow Dancer: The Secret of Shinobi. But unlike Revenge of Shinobi, which was a console-exclusive sequel to the original arcade game, Shadow Dancer is actually based on the arcade sequel to the arcade game, though it's not entirely faithful to its coin-op cousin. It can be a little confusing. Let me explain. In November 1989, around the same time Revenge of Shinobi was hitting the Mega Drive, Sega released a direct-to-arcade sequel called Shadow Dancer. It featured Joe Musashi's son Hayate and his dog Yamato. The major gameplay improvement here was the ability to attack enemies with Yamato, briefly stunning them and giving Hayate a chance to safely take them out. The Sega Master System got a direct port of the arcade game in 1991. It's actually pretty impressive, all things considered, though Yamato didn't make the cut and the game is way too hard. The Mega Drive version of Shadow Dancer is very similar to the previously released eSWAT, in that it's not as much a direct port as it is inspired by the arcade original. You can see it almost immediately. The first level of Shadow Dancer is an earthquake-racked city on fire, as opposed to the arcade's airport setting. And the game just diverges even more from there. In an interview with the Sega Mega Drive Genesis Collected Works, director Tomohiro Kondo talked about how he wanted to preserve the fundamentals of the arcade game, but he was also aware that it wasn't necessarily the best console experience. So he chose to make a game that added a bit of complexity and played to the Mega Drive's strength. Shadow Dancer feels like a throwback to that first game in a lot of ways. While Revenge of Shinobi introduced the concept of a life bar and weapon management to the series, Shadow Dancer goes back to unlimited throwing stars and one-hit deaths. Shadow Dancer also brings back the first-person bonus stages. Well, the arcade version did anyway. The Mega Drive version has a much cooler bonus stage as far as I'm concerned. Pro tip, falling down the left side of the bonus stage and spamming on the fire button will almost always net you 3 extra lives. Or if you don't hit a single ninja on the way down, you automatically get a single one up. Even though it plays a lot like the original Shinobi, Shadow Dancer manages to feel fresh thanks to the inclusion of the dog Yamato. Sure, he barks a bit too much, but he's great for getting Hayate out of a jam, especially when you come across enemies that are laying prone and firing at you. Yamato will get them standing up in a hurry and unable to attack. He's a great midpoint between your standard offense and the screen-clearing ninja magic. One weird bit about this game, when it made the trip across the Pacific, Sega of America decided that it should star the original main character, Joe Musashi. It doesn't really affect the game in any way, it's just an odd little change in the US localization. From a presentation standpoint, Shadow Dancer just oozes style. In that same Collected Works interview, Tomohiro Kondo says the stages for the Mega Drive version were changed due to the severe size limit of the cartridge. Fitting the large set pieces found in the arcade game on a 4 meg cartridge just wasn't an option. So the team decided to go for a more tile-based approach, leaving the Statue of Liberty to be the one major set piece in the game. And while that stage does look cool, nearly every area of Shadow Dancer has an incredible visual style. But my favorite bit about the game has to be the soundtrack. Well, the entire sound design, actually. The music just has this great vibe all its own, and it's accompanied by some really unique sound effects. I especially love the use of voice samples in the bonus stage. In the Collected Works interview, Tomohiro Kondo notes that another team was working on Revenge of Shinobi at the same time his team was toiling away on Shadow Dancer, and he praises that game. In particular, he praises the amazing soundtrack by Yuzo Koshiro. But really, Keisuke Sukahara's Shadow Dancer soundtrack is great in its own right. Shadow Dancer brings both a classic Shinobi style while giving the whole thing a very modern facelift, and succeeds in almost every way. In August 1982, Commodore International released its new 8-bit home computer, the follow-up to its million-selling VIC-20, the Commodore 64. Over the next 12 years, it would go on to become the most successful single computer model of all time, selling upwards of 17 million units worldwide. Even after Commodore and other manufacturers moved on to 16-bit computers in the mid-80s, the 64 still managed to remain popular. However, by the late 80s, game consoles were starting to eat into Commodore's market. The 64 had amassed quite a library of games during its long lifespan, and so Commodore's management came up with a plan to combat this threat, stripped down the venerable Commodore 64 to nothing but the board, a cartridge slot, and a controller. In December 1990, it shipped the Commodore 64 game system, more commonly referred to as the Commodore 64 GS. This is almost literally a Commodore 64, but with all the expansion slots removed or covered up by the casing, and missing the keyboard. I can only assume this was meant to keep costs down in order to undercut other microcomputers and game consoles of the day. The 64 GS released to much fanfare from Commodore itself, with a 99 British pounds price tag and the promise of 100 games for the system by Christmas. It shipped with a 4-game cartridge that featured International Soccer, Clax, Flimbo's Quest, and Fiendish Freddy's Big Top of Fun. The system had further problems. It was essentially compatible with every Commodore 64 cartridge game on the market, but because most of those required keyboard input to either play or even start the game, they were impossible to play on the 64 GS. Heck, one of the biggest releases for the system was Terminator 2, with the 64 GS badge right on the box. Unfortunately, someone somewhere screwed up, and the game actually required keyboard input to start. This cartridge-only setup led to further problems, as many of the games on the 64 were housed on cassette or floppy disk, which were usually much cheaper. Thus, even if your 64 GS game was simply a port of an older cassette game, it cost more at retail. Even the pack-in cartridge featured 3 cassette ports, and International Soccer was actually a re-release from 1983. Out of the long list of major problems faced by the 64 GS, the biggest was the fact that the hardware was just far too old to be worth purchasing. Just like Amstrad's GX4000, released only weeks earlier, Commodore had repackaged an old 8-bit computer right at the time when Nintendo and Sega were pushing 16-bit game consoles. Ultimately, there were only about 80,000 Commodore 64 game systems manufactured, and of those, less than 25% were actually sold. And those 100 games Commodore promised by Christmas, only 28 of them were ever released during the system's lifespan. And only 9 of those were original games. The rest were ports of older Commodore 64 titles. Commodore itself never published another cartridge for the system outside of the original pack-in. The Commodore 64 game system was discontinued after only a few months on the market. The first wrestling game on the Mega Drive is kind of a surprise in that it features nothing but female characters. Cutie Suzuki no Ringside Angel marks the return of Asmic, the publisher which previously released the underwhelming Air Diver. Cutie Suzuki was a real wrestler, part of the roster of the Japan Women's Pro Wrestling promotion, and later as part of the JWP Project promotion. Based on her Wikipedia entry, she wasn't wildly successful as a singles competitor, holding the UWA and JWP Junior Championship only one time. In the JWT project, she was tag team champion 5 times, though all of that happened years after this game was released. I assume she was pretty popular though. There are tons of photos of her all over the internet, and she went on to do a bit of acting. Seems like a Jake the Snake Roberts or Ted DiBiase type. Very popular in her time, but not a megastar along the lines of a Stone Cold Steve Austin or Hulk Hogan. In fact, she exudes sort of a Japanese idol vibe. Heck, even the game case features 2 pictures of her thanks to the lenticular cover. Another first for the Mega Drive, I guess? All of the other characters in Ringside Angel are fictional. Wrestling video games have always felt pretty rough to me. A lot of button pounding with no really clear indication of how well you're actually doing. I know that doesn't describe every single wrestling game out there. Some of them are actually really good, but the lion's share of them are pretty mediocre, relying more on their presentation than their gameplay. Ringside Angel falls squarely into that category. The character portraits and sprites are actually pretty cool, even though every single fighter features the exact same body type. I also really dig the idea of the commentators in the top right corner. Watch closely and you'll see Asmik's mascot Boomer make an appearance, as well as folks who look a lot like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Colonel Sanders of all people. The game, though, is damn near unplayable. It feels like there are lots of different moves. In fact, I think you can assign moves before each match. But the gameplay wears thin really quickly, which is exacerbated by the ridiculous length of each match. Even when you've got your opponent down to 0 health and her character portrait is showing real pain, it seems impossible to pin them. Cutie Suzuki no Ringside Angel is the second and final appearance on the Mega Drive by developer Copia System. It would go on to release more games for the Super Famicom and the Game Boy.
And that'll do it for this episode of Generation 16. Thanks for watching. Join me next time when an important new developer joins the Genesis family, and we take a look at the Mega Drive around the world. See you then. Thanks for watching. If you liked what you saw, please consider subscribing to the channel, as well as supporting the show on Patreon. And of course, please visit the website and give the Facebook page a like. Thanks for your support.